generally rent a house down in somewhere in Nayarit or
Uh-huh.
somewhere like that. So we'd end up down there for Christmas and then have a couple weeks there and then drive around a little bit more.
Yeah,
That was
it's
before we had
amazing.
kids. But
Me too. Yeah, I was pre-kids too. But I
yeah,
love I love Mexico City.
yeah,
I just pardon?
yeah. Mexico City's that's a such a weird big place.
Oh, it's amazing. I have spent a lot of time there and just I love it. And then my friend just inherited an apartment there right in Roma. So I'm excited to start spending more time there when I can.
Right. Oh,
No,
sounds good.
Mexico City is fascinating. I mean, and I, everything from the music to the architecture, it's just, I love, and the art. I mean, but the art scene is fascinating.
Right.
My girlfriend has started going there like a few times a year just because she's gotten really into the art scene in Mexico City.
Yeah, we did. We were working with a band of. They weren't really from Mexico City. They were mostly from further north, called Los Lichis. There were all these guys. They were visual artists, but they would get
Lychees,
together
like
and do these
milk? What's it,
like
lychees?
Lichis.
Oh,
It's leeches, really.
oh, I think it said leches,
L-
milk. I think you were saying milk.
Los Lichis. Los
Lychees.
Lichis.
Yeah, those
Yeah.
lychees.
And they would do all these incredible installations and all this really weird shit. So we did a record of their like that they had done a documentation of a lot of their stuff. Then we did a record with them with the French artist Paquito Bellino, who runs a Le Dernier Cri, which is that big silkscreen thing.
Oh,
It's a
cool.
there's kind of a crazy scene, but
Well, we can
very hard to figure out.
we can go into more depth in this because my girlfriend goes down there for this printmaking residency outside Mexico City, and she deals with all these
Uh,
like Mexican artists, and so I'll
right.
fill you in on that. But welcome. So, what town are
Yeah.
you in, Byron? Where are you? Florence?
Right now I'm in Deerfield, Massachusetts.
Oh, Deerfield. So,
Yeah,
and how long have you been in
that's where I
Deerfield?
live.
How long have you been there?
Um, I've been here about 25 years.
Yeah. Oh, good. Oh, good. Okay. Um, well, class is coming
My
back.
store's Yeah, the
Pardon?
store is over in Florence. The
I'm
store we have is over in Florence, and the label.
right.
So
Yeah. Well, I know students will want to hear about that as well. But people are coming back, so I'll make introductions now. Um, so Byron, this is Byron Coley, everyone. This is the class. There's about 24 students here today. We got a good turnout. We've been meeting virtually. Uh, we've been meeting through Zoom because I my schedule doesn't allow me to test every Monday to so I can't go into the building, the art building,
right.
just
Mhm.
because this well it sucks. I mean, as you know. Um,
Yeah.
so
Sweet.
we've been living virtually, and the one big benefit is we've been able to, for like this seminar, Kill Your Semiotics, critical history of post-punk, we've been able to have interesting people come in like you and people from New York and Amsterdam, all sorts of really interesting people who have a good knowledge of art and culture, and then can also get into the weeds on post-punk and no wave and stuff like that. And it's been tremendous for us. And I remember a year ago, just about a year ago, I think I saw, what's it called, Desolation Center.
Right. Right.
Weren't you moderating a conversation on that? On
Yeah. Yeah, I
that was
did.
that was just about a year ago,
So
right?
yeah, it must have been because it was the beginning of all the Zoom stuff.
And that
We
was my
got
first.
Zoom bombed on that.
That was my one and only Zoom bomb, and it was
I
an
know that was
epic
pretty
Zoom.
good.
That was an epic Zoom bomb.
It was, but
It was
the idea was
epic.
so funny because the Desolation Center guys were sort of involved with people who had been involved with putting on like the throbbing gristle shows and stuff like that in LA. So the
Right.
thought that guys could come on and like play some pornography or like do
Nazi
these
stuff.
weird like Nazi stuff that would somehow shock people who had like paid money to go see throbbing gristle. It was it was just so idiotic. It was like it was good because
Yeah.
we just talked through it and they started kicking people off until they finally found the root source.
Yes. You know what? Someone found out about that Zoom bomb that I was on it, and I ended up being interviewed by like the University of Chicago about my experience on that Zoom.
Uh-huh.
and I was on some podcast,
Cool.
and the University of Chicago had something about like, the pandemic and Zoom culture, and they heard about
Right.
my experience on that. It was very funny. So it led to this other stuff. Um, but just as an aside, I'm taking this film class right now. I'm taking a film class on top of teaching two classes um, with the critic Steve Dollar down in Tallahassee. And last week we had, and I'm blanking on his name, the uh, the person who edited Desolation Center. We watched Desolation Center, and then we had like an hour and a half conversation with the editor, Markley.
Right.
Is that it, Markley? Trevor? I'm blank.
I knew Stuart Easy and some of the guys who were putting the stuff on. I didn't really know the filmmakers quite as much.
Yeah. So
So
it was interesting to actually, speak with somebody who was like really spent years working on that, making that film, as well as
yeah.
many other films, like his amazing film on Tony Conrad and all. He's done so
Right.
many films and documentaries. But we're on a side. Sorry, we're down to, it's too early for that rabbit hole. I want to welcome everyone. I want to welcome Byron Coley to our Maine College of Art. Uh, Kill Your Semiotics, a critical history of post-punk class, where we've been looking at all things post-punk aesthetics, looking back as far as John Cage and all different artists, and sort of tracing sort of the lineage of a lot of these ideas up through Yvonne Rainer, No Manifesto, and then all the way up through today. Um, and today it's great we can have someone like Byron come in class, because Byron's a poet, a cultural critic, runs a record label, is heavily involved with sort of contemporary poetry, as well as poetry, sort of underground poetry going back to the 60s and 50s. Really no stone unturned there. Even's written books about like Chuck Norris. What is it?
Yeah. Yes.
Chuck Norris. I mean, I'm telling you, there's a voracious mind. But I mean, so the amazing thing though is to have Byron here is like, this is like, like someone who's sort of witnessed all this stuff, and written about it from day one, and put a voice to this. It's very important to, when we're hearing stuff, whatever, to sort of, so Byron's constantly sort of taking these snapshots in time, writing about stuff, and then within those snapshots, sort of like giving us some sort of cultural references in these reviews that he writes for all these different journals and magazines. So very sort of much situating himself into this art, visual and music world. We might focus a lot here on music, but there's a lot of other things going on. So we're just really, really lucky, because I have books like this book. It's like sort of collected early writings. I won't, some of the stuff's rated R, and I won't talk about it right now, but there's some excellent stuff in here. This is, if I understand, there's a lot of like, this is sort of like almost like a person. It's almost like a memoir through your writings, right?
It is, yeah, sort of. Because when I was actually when I was working not on that when I was actually working on the No Wave book, an old friend of mine, Angela Yeager,
Yep.
I was talking to her about it, and she was like, "Oh, I have all the letters that you wrote me over the years about just going out to shows and seeing stuff like that, because we would write each other." She lived in England. She lived in the X-ray spec squat in England,
Wow.
and I was
Yeah.
in San Francisco, between San Francisco and New York. And I mean, she'd been a roadie for Teenage Jesus. Anyway, I mean, she's the one who introduced me to Lydia. Anyway, we'd write these long letters about what we had seen, and I had lost all my correspondence, but she still had these letters. So that book actually had some, yeah, it has a bunch of that
Yeah.
correspondence type stuff.
Right. So I think,
It's
and
pretty,
then you have other more recent books out of poetry and other things, and we have students who have some
yeah,
questions. But so I think
right.
Byron's great to bring into this class, because like I said, you have someone who's sort of like there, experienced it, lived it, but also was thinking about it as it happened. That's how I want to put it. It wasn't just sort of washing over you. I mean, you had a critical eye and an ear. I mean, it was obviously fun, and you still do, right? So I mean, this is a continuum of your life. It hasn't, you never hit
Right.
pause, right? There's no pause button.
No, I never decided to really get a job or anything. It's sort of
Right. So you
opted
never
out.
hit pause. I mean, this is an ongoing project. If you want to be pretentious about it,
Right. Yeah.
this is an ongoing effort that doesn't stop.
No, well, I mean, the thing is, to me, there's kind of a breaking point at the Second World War, but after the Second World War, you can get into this sort of international underground continuum that sort of flows from there through stuff that's going on now,
Right.
regardless of how disparate the parts are. There was an international connection that was sort of set up then that continues, and it's a sort of it's underground and sub-underground, and there's many subterranean levels
And
of
certain
culture going on all
suburban,
the time.
sounds out of Mexico, Mexico City, right?
Yeah, right,
It
right.
can get
Yeah.
very
So
particular.
you can, and the thing is that each of these scenes have their own very specific and detailed histories, which is kind of weird because unfortunately so many of them happen in a very ephemeral way, and the way that they're documented is in such there's very little written documentation of some of it. It's oral and things like that. So if somebody doesn't really make an effort to track information down, it dies with people's memories. It's like this no wave book that Thurston and I did, which came out in 2008. I think we worked on for about 4 years, and a lot of those people had never talked about the stuff, or they said, people like Lydia Lunch, who was in Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, and was sort of a central character, had said, "I'm never going to do an interview about that stuff again." But since we sort of knew all these people and had worked with some of them, they were like, "Okay, look, I'll do one more. I'll talk about this stuff one time."
Right.
But we were able to track down a lot of people who had been, really nobody had really known where they ended up or anything like that, because the no wave scene in New York, a lot of the people who were involved with that were not musicians at all. A lot of them were people who had come to New York to do one thing or another. Quite a few of them came to do visual art. Some of them came to do theater, like Glenn Branca came to do theater. A great number of them were visual artists. But there were people who came to do sort of poetry and writing and stuff like that also. But they ended up in this scene where the stuff that was really exciting that was going on then was the early CBGB scene. And so they were going out to clubs and seeing stuff, and they were like, oh, the interesting thing about punk, or whatever you call it in a way, was the idea that it was both destroying the barrier between audience and performer in terms of requisite technique.
Right. Yeah.
Prior to that, there'd been if you went, if you were going to concerts before then, you would go to a big concert hall and you'd see a band with a big sound system and, very professional stuff, lights, all this stuff going on. If you went to a bar, it was just a bar band, and that was almost just playing background music. But there was a period in the 70s then where it started, where there were bands who were not being sponsored by record companies, who were playing original music in these sort of like scummy situations, whether they were old neighborhood bars or they were biker bars or they were whatever they were. But it was not going there to do just to like play background music. It was, you were going to actually see these bands.
Yeah, when
And
we've talked about that, sort of situating that in the situation as sort of this,
right,
with Guy Debord, this idea of like being very present in
right,
the city and like actively engaging with your sort of body and your heart and your mind with your surroundings.
yeah, yeah. Well, there's
And
there's that, and it all does sort of fit together like that. But the thing is though that although the idea existed of what a band like the Ramones played or something like that, or before that a band like the New York Dolls, that they weren't very technically proficient. They were proficient to the degree that they could play Chuck Berry riffs or things like that. There was a break then, really, with a band like Teenage Jesus, or Mars really, who were the first band like this, where these really weren't musicians. They were kind of non-musicians using music as a way to create some sort of weird art, even if they were just trying to do Roxy Music or Velvet Underground like songs. They didn't actually know how to do that. So when they would try to recreate these things sonically, they ended up with something that was absolutely original and so weird sounding, you really couldn't put a finger on it.
Right. Last week we had Pat Place come in, and I like to say with Pat, she came to New York for the art and stayed for the music, right? So, I mean, she was an artist.
Yeah, you know, and it's true.
She was an artist, and somehow
She was.
a guitar ended up in her hand, and then she made these amazing guitar riffs that we love to today. You know,
I know, and the only reason she moved to guitar was because she failed her audition as a bass player. You know,
she did not bring that up.
I mean, yeah, no, she originally had wanted to play bass because she thought it was the easiest thing to play, and she went to audition for the Contortions, and they were like, "Oh, no, your bass isn't good enough."
Well, that rhythm section
maybe
guitar. Made the band. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Oh no, it really did. But I mean but you know, I mean, the reason she was in that band was Chance liked the way she looked. You know, he went up to her at CB's and was like, "Oh, you know, what band are you in?" you look like you should play in a band. And you know, it was the same.
That's how Johnny Lydon was discovered by Malcolm McLaren, right? The way he looked.
Exactly. Well, you know,
someone took McLaren to see Johnny Rotten, and then Johnny Rotten, of course, became much more than McLaren ever thought he could be.
That's definitely true. And I mean, the thing is, I mean, if you're talking about very specific post-punk stuff, yeah. I mean, the title of our book was No Wave Post-Punk Underground New York, 1976 to 1980. Now, I mean, it's ridiculous at a certain point to say that anything from 1976 was post-punk,
right?
Because, you know, when you get into the really the chronology of how punk happens, you know, I mean, the thing is, it didn't exist as anything graspable really until the first Ramones album came out, and because then people
what was that called? And do you know the year?
That was May '76.
Ramones.
And that was, it was just called the Ramones.
Right. Yeah.
May '76, and it was, you know, it was a widely reviewed record, but mostly poorly reviewed. You know, but Sire had the idea of marketing it, even using the like terrible reviews and the good reviews too, because some people thought like this is one of the most crazy things, amazing things I've ever heard, and other people were like, oh, this isn't anything. This is not music. And it's funny because if you listen to the first Ramones album now, it will sound very tame, very obviously
compared to like
very super.
Yeah, compared to like
oh yes,
Arto
it sounds
Lindsay.
super.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it sounds super musical. You know.
Yeah.
You know, whereas a guy like Arto Lindsay from DNA, his whole idea was just about. You know, he had no real rock roots at all. He was coming more out of different things. I mean, but it's the reason some of those bands exist though are unusual because like Arto from DNA, Mark Cunningham from the band Mars, Gordon Stevenson, who was in Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, Bobby Swope, who was in Beirut Slump. These are all no-wave bands. Right. As well as Mark Pauline, who was the founder of Survival Research Laboratories, who were a big West Coast
Desolation Center
events-based. Yeah, Desolation Center, machine construction. They all went to a small college in Florida together called Eckerd College.
Wow. Yeah, right, exactly.
We're also Muriel and Exene Cervenka, the Cervenka sisters, were in it was in St. Petersburg, and they just hung around campus all the time and even did art shows on campus. And Muriel and Gordon got married and moved to New York, and Exene, of course, went out to Los Angeles and founded the band X out there. And Mark went to San Francisco and did Survival Research. And there are these little nubs of activity that transplant themselves, and this person knows that person. These scenes are so small inside these cities at that point that it's kind of odd how weird. A lot of people worked at the Strand bookstore in New York because it was an easy job to get. Whether it was Robert Crutchfield from DNA or Jody Harris from the Contortions or Robert Quine from Richard Hell's band, who produced a lot of no wave stuff. Miriam Linna, who was in the Cramps, who was Lydia's roommate at a place at an abandoned building called the Hole when she was first in the Cramps. All these people worked at the same bookstores. Mark Cunningham also worked at 8th Street Books. It was just like people go at that time, and I assume it still happens. People are drawn to cities. People who grow up in the suburbs read about activities going on in different metropolitan places, especially if there's a big bohemian thing, and they get drawn to there. It happened at that particular time in New York. You could live in New York really, really cheaply as long as you didn't mind living somewhere that nobody else really wanted to live. Certainly no middle class people wanted to live there. And so, people drifted up from Florida or where Pat came from, Pat Place came from, where Illinois, I guess.
Yeah, art school in Illinois, right?
Yeah, just different stuff like that. But you'd want to go to New York because, it's filmmakers, everything's there. It's like the Fluxus people are there. The filmmakers cooperative is there. There's an really active art scene going on, everywhere. And then you get there and you realize there's stuff like Collab, and there's there are all these groups who, these affinity groups of people who are just poor people making art. And it's like nothing else. And then there'd be occasionally, you're in the history of the no wave, you run into, you do run into people like Richard Serra, the sculptor, who's obviously very well known, but when he came to Manhattan, he rented what had been a hospital all the way down at the south end of Manhattan. And then all these people sort of ended up living, he could rent out parts of that. But Manhattan was really lower Manhattan was deserted.
Well, I'd like to hear more about this Richard Serra. I mean, I know Serra very well, the work very well.
Right.
And in my mind, when I think of New York and I think of No Wave, there's a perfectly good connection to people like Richard Serra or Robert Smithson or Yvonne Rainer.
Right.
But so I think it's fascinating that he had this real estate, right? Are you saying that there's like a secret history there in that real estate where it was like a Eckerd College out of college where people were able to sort of live and come to fruition?
Well, in a certain kind of a way. I mean, but Manhattan was, I don't know. I was born in Manhattan, and I grew up outside the city, and we'd go into Manhattan all the time. When I was a kid, we only lived about 40 minutes outside Manhattan, so you'd go in there, and where you'd go were the same kind of places all the time. And then you'd start realizing, when you come in and you look at Empire State Building and you think that's sort of the heart of town, there's not as much of no. When they built the World Trade Center, then you realize, the island even goes down further south than that.
Right.
And you'd go down to these places that were almost deserted neighborhoods, and some had buildings that went back. They looked like they were from the Dutch era still, although I'm sure they weren't. They'd probably been, different iterations, but old brick buildings that were like nothing. And so a lot of these people, like Donnie Christensen, who was the drummer in the Contortions and had a band before that called the Loose Screws with David Hofstra and Jody Harris, that James Chance from the Contortions used to sit in with. This would be in '75. He had a big building way, way down in lower Manhattan, that he just rented for almost nothing. And you'd go down there and there were no bodegas open. There was really nothing down there, no services. But it didn't cost anything to live there. Mm-hmm. I remember I used to DJ at this club down on White Street called Tier 3. That's before Robert De Niro took over rehabbed Tribeca.
Yes.
Tribeca was really cheap. Tribeca meant the triangle below Canal Street.
Right.
And that was there was not much going on there. And Tier 3 was down right near where the Mud Club was. And I was living in the New York Rocker office on 23rd Street.
Where was that, 23rd?
That was just below 22nd Street and Broadway.
How old were you then?
And, I was in my early 20s.
Was that after college, or was it?
Yeah, but I left college in '76, so
Okay.
yeah, it was right in there.
When did you start visiting New York, sort of like on your own, and sort of sort of exploring it and sort of picking up the nuances of it? Like what age was that?
Well,
Like
I didn't.
late teens?
Yeah, really. I mean, we would go in there earlier, but before you really found out about the way downtown,
Yeah.
that was sort of later. That was like the later part of my teens.
Uh-huh.
Well, when I was in college, I had friends who stayed living in Manhattan, and so you'd go and see them, and they'd take you down to weird, wherever weird. We're always looking for weird places where stuff was cheap, and there were a lot of really kind of at that point there were a lot of places like if we wanted to see weird movies, which is something we always like to do. There were a lot of places that were just really ad hoc movie theaters where guys would really there'd just be a sheet up kind of a thing or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there'd be sort of pop-up things. It'd be in the back of like a store that wasn't a store anymore or something like that. And you could go in and watch movies, like whatever, that kind of stuff. George Cukor movies, or like whatever, just oddball stuff you'd hear about.
Yeah.
I mean, plenty of that stuff was showing uptown as well at the museums and stuff. But so I started figuring out that, and there were also a lot of weird bars down there, and like the Bowery was really like a really, and Elizabeth Street even more, but like it was still bums everywhere, and these illegal bars and stuff like that. It was just a weird place, and it was that way up. Really, the end of that period is I don't know if you guys have talked about the Times Square show in New York.
No, I'd love to hear about that.
Was in 1980, the summer of 80. What happened was that's when everything got sold to like Disney.
Right.
And so all the buildings were getting emptied out in Times Square.
Oh, this is what the show The Deuce is about. Sorry. I think isn't the show that sort of covers that time period in that real estate transaction. But go on, sorry.
But all these people got to take over there was a huge underground art show installation that was everywhere in Times Square in that period, and all these people had all the places that had been porn stores and whatever else, movie theaters, got filled up with all this other stuff for this brief period while they were trying to get the rest of their real estate deals together and get everything finished so they could really start working on transforming it. And I have to say I have never been to Times Square since then.
So was that in some ways, was that transaction? Because we talked a lot about, these things happening, right, that are part of our history. We often look about that sort of that major transaction. Was that sort of like for you, a way to sort of end No Wave at 1980 because of was that real estate transaction sort of part of that bigger picture of change?
It was a part of a change of New York. But the thing is, a lot of times when you're dealing with music history in a scene that's changing very quickly, I mean, it's a week to week kind of thing. Like so much can happen in a week. A band comes from out of town and plays, and like everybody gets their minds blown by that, right, and it's like, whoa. And then the next week you start seeing that influence already with other people doing stuff like that.
Is there an example of something you could think of that happened like that with a musician or artist who brought something to New York and influenced what was happening there?
I mean, bands that came from really nowhere, conceptually nowhere, that I know hit New York really crazily, and you could see the things. One would have been Devo when the first time they came from Akron.
Sure.
And they showed up with their suits, and they did. I think that. I can't remember if they did an audition night at CBGB's or they did Max's, but all of a sudden it was like, whoa, this is so different. And you'd start to hear people doing things that had little bits of that in their own stuff. And I would have been like the B-50, the B-52s when they came. Again, it was just they played audition night at CBGB's, and the next week people had beehive hairdos and stuff. Yeah. And there's stuff like that happens that nobody pays any attention to. Like the Crass came to New York, I think in 79,
from
and they
England,
played they played a show with the Contortions.
Wow.
At an abandoned schoolhouse on Second Avenue.
So Pat was in the band then, yeah. Pat Place was in the Contortions, yeah. In a band. Wow, I do not know about that show. That's interesting.
Right.
So Crass Crassus brought, something very different for them, I think, compared to a lot of the no wave stuff. Was they had more of like a deliberately almost political bent to them, correct?
Oh, they had a very political bent.
Yeah,
I mean,
which was not
if
no
there's
wave.
something, the no wave had no real political
Yeah,
agenda
so
at all.
yeah, so Crass is very interesting to bring into this dialogue. Yeah,
Yeah. The thing is, though, people hate to have it broken up that way. But let me just pour this off for a second.
no problem.
But there were sort of two different. The no wave, in a way, was broken into two different factions. Although it was after the fact, and it's kind of that's the only thing that's political about it. And the thing is, you have to realize, no wave was not called no wave while it was happening. I mean, that just didn't. It didn't really exist as a term. Lydia, I think, used it in an interview with Roy Trakin in New York Rocker as kind of a joke, like, "Oh, they're new wave, we're no wave."
Right.
But the first time it really got codified was when Eno put together the No New York compilation for the Island subsidiary label Antilles. Before that, nobody had really called it much of anything. But when that happened, the four bands that were chosen to be on there, which were Mars, DNA, The Contortions, and Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, and they were all bands that rehearsed in one place, and there were a lot of
right time,
interconnections.
right time, right place, right? Yeah.
Yeah, they rehearsed at this loft that Lydia had on Delancey Street. But there were a bunch of other bands around at that time, notably bands it'd be like the Theoretical Girls, the Gynecologists, stuff like that. Bands that involve people like Reese Chatham and Glenn Branca.
Right.
Glenn is dead now, but Reese has been very active in stuff, and Barbara S. was in a bunch of that stuff. She's a lot of people who are more involved in art stuff.
And she just died.
Very, very, yeah, very, very specifically art-oriented bands, and they were sort of more based on the west side of Manhattan.
So I like how you get granular with the geography.
Well, you have to. There's the Lower East Side.
Right.
Was very specific. The Lower West Side was more art. I mean, it was more. There were more lofts over there, and the bar over there, which was called Barnabas Rex, was like an artist bar. So, you'd be as likely to see, I don't know, John Chamberlain there as somebody else. But if you were on the East Side, the only artists you would see generally in those places were more people who were involved in the Warhol scene a little bit more.
Sure.
Yep. And it's kind of a big distinction in a way. I mean, it seems a little stupid, but it is.
I love it.
It's just sort of the way it was.
That makes me think of the fact. Sorry, that makes me think of like that. Like Gordon Amato Clark opened up food, and that was to serve the artists, and that was not in the East Village. It was on the other side,
right?
Because he was serving his community, which was the visual artists living in these lofts. So the architecture, the means and access to this affordable architecture, you can look at that sort of building typology and how it relates to what happens in terms of the artists and the scenes that then evolved out of it, right? So it's fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, New York, because the buildings are so tall there, it's like you don't stand on the west side and be able to see the east side from anywhere. Every avenue is a canyon almost, and has its own specific kind of a cultural climate, that doesn't necessarily transfer, and it's both north and south and east and west, because New York's set up as a grid like that, and things have a tendency to migrate together in very certain ways. And there were, like the punk clubs were on the east side,
right?
There weren't punk clubs on the west side. The only real clubs that were on the west side, I mean, Mickey Ruskin, who had run Max's Kansas City, which was a pretty famous club, and he had been an art guy, so a lot of artists drank there and traded art for stuff like that.
Sure.
When he closed that, he opened a club all the way over on the west side. It was called the Lower Manhattan Ocean Club.
What was his first
And so
club
people
called? What was his first club?
Max's it was called Max's Kansas City.
Oh, sorry, of course, Max. So he started
Yeah.
Max's, and then was the Ocean Club going at the same time as Max's, or was it afterwards?
Yes, but he sold Max's in 75.
Okay.
74, and then Peter Crowley reopened it in 75. And so its punk era was under Peter Crowley's ownership.
Okay.
Nicky Ruskin no longer owned it at that point. He had a place called the Lower Manhattan Ocean Club, and over on the west side was also more like where the artist space was, and
which
the
is
later
central
kitchen.
to, and artist
Yeah.
space ends up being central to No Wave, and we talked about
Yeah.
that's where E and Eno, right, saw Mars, saw Contortions, saw every band that's on that album.
Yes, basically, yes.
I mean,
he was in town. Go ahead.
I'm just saying that we love these sort of nexuses like Eckerd College or artist space, where these events happen, these sort of breeding grounds within these cultures. I mean, if artist space didn't exist, no New York album may not have happened, right?
That's absolutely true.
And
because I think the backstory really on the No New York album is that it was something of a concept originally put forward by Anya Phillips. Anya Phillips was a scenester in New York who later got involved with James Chance and managed him and was his partner in all things. But originally, she was a dominatrix. I mean, that was her original gig, and so she was an extremely bossy and mean woman. But she was like really best friends with like Debbie Harry. Like that's where I first met her. I think was at the first annual World Sleaze Convention in Wilmington, Delaware.
When is that? Is that something to do with John Waters?
Well, it was all these John Waters like proteges.
Oh, okay.
It was in September 1976. They held this thing called the first annual World Sleaze Convention, and I went down there. I was helping running a booth for Punk magazine, and like our table next to us, Edie the Egg Lady had her like junk store set up there, and this was all these guys who were sort of like, they had like, they had a peep show booth you could watch movies in, and it was a Rondo Hatton film festival, all this just crazy stuff, and it was basically run these, a bunch of gay artists from Wilmington, Delaware, because Wilmington was a very inexpensive city in those days, so it had a big pull from southern things. And it was a great event. But I mean, I remember that's where I met Anya, and she had came with Debbie Harry, and she was one of the meanest people I had ever met. Anyway, she was supposedly having an involvement with Eno when he was in town.
Oh wait, he was into bondage?
This is absolutely hearsay, but this is. A bunch of people have said this, that he and Anya were acquainted, whether on professional terms or just, I don't really know.
Well,
Anyway,
that's a whole new secret history there. Sure, great.
Well, Eno was in town mixing the second Talking Heads album, and he decided he wanted to stay for a while. And Steve Moss, who's the guy who opened the Muck Club in 1978, told Eno he could just stay in his apartment because he was going out of town. So Eno stayed there, and ended up living in New York for a while. But at that period was right when he was there, was right when that series of artist space shows. It was a week of shows. And supposedly Anya dragged him over to go to see this stuff. And then was like, you should record all this stuff. And he got interested in it because, like, he sensed how ephemeral this stuff people burn through this stuff fast. He was super interested because it was like punk, but it was not punk, and it was just like, it was weird, aggressive stuff, but not any kind of formulaic thing. All those bands sound so different from each other, but they all sound equally odd. And some of them sound great, and some of them, are more of a matter of taste. But it was a kind of overwhelming. And he was like, oh, he got in touch with Chris Blackwell and said, we could document this. He's going, nobody will buy it, but then it'll be documented, and it won't cost anything to do. And basically, that's what they did. But everybody sort of says they thought Anya was sort of the driving force behind getting.
Well, yeah, that's it. Sounds like, I mean, right. I think absolutely. I understand how a person like that, someone who's determined and who can make the right connections. That's how things
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah, and if that album would have never come out, what, whether there would have even been an appreciation of these bands as a scene rather than just individual weird bands is really questionable. But once the name started getting used, then it made it possible for some of the people who are also doing film then to be doing what they called no wave cinema and open the new cinema on St. Mark's, like I think Seth Tillett or whoever opened that up on St. Mark's.
So that'd be like
with
Vivian Dick and people like that. And
oh yeah, all those people, Scott and Beth B, and there were a bunch of people.
Nares, Jamie Nares.
Yeah, James Nares, who was in the Contortions also.
Right. Now Jamie.
Yeah, Big Brush, the Big Brush man. And but and the thing is, everybody had cameras because of the blackout. You know that story, right?
No, we want to hear it.
Well, New York had that in the summer of '77, July '77, like about 2 weeks before they finally caught the son of Sam, who was a serial killer who was haunting New York boroughs. There was a blackout in New York in July '77, and two things came out of that. That's one where everybody had a boombox after that. Like boombox culture exploded because before that, those huge portable radios had been too expensive, so nobody had them. But after the blackout, everybody had looted all the stores of them, so they were all around, everywhere. And I think it had a lot to do with the beginning of sort of like the proto hip hop culture, also in terms of some of that stuff.
I think
but somebody at the same time had looted a whole truckload of 16 millimeter cameras. And so there was a fence in the East Village, a guy who sold stolen material, who was selling these 16 millimeter cameras really cheap. And that's where everybody got their cameras.
Those are like your classic sort of Bolex 16 millimeter camera.
Yeah, like Eric Mitchell, like all those guys got their cameras. John Lurie, like all those guys. And those guys were all sort of friends. And they had a sort of separate operation. A lot of these guys were people who were involved in a band that became known as the Lounge Lizards, which was a band sort of led by John Lurie, although Nares had been involved in the original thing, and they were originally called the Rotating Power Tools. But they were guys who dressed really sharp. Like most of the people who were involved in the no wave scene and just dressed pretty regularly. They didn't really get dressed up, apart from Lydia or some people who would wear sort of like bondage type outfits or whatever. But these guys were into like wearing like 40, like thrift store 40s suits, and you see them around. I just could never figure out how they would look so well dressed all the time. They obviously put a lot of effort into it.
And we saw John Lurie and Stranger Than Paradise, which we screened a few weeks back, and
right.
And that's in terms of popular culture, one of the more popular outgrowths of no wave. So the students have seen John Lurie.
You know what you should try to get? If you get a print of Nares film, Rome '78.
Oh, I've seen only clip parts of that. Yeah,
it's unbelievable.
I think
almost every person from the no wave scene is in it.
Yeah, Pat's in it. I've seen a scene with Pat Place and Lydia Lunch.
Everybody's in it.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it's about the fall of Rome under Caligula. It's so fantastic. But shot in like the parks of New York. With everybody talking in like really extreme New York accents as much as they can.
Yeah.
But anyway, so these things happened at the same time, because really even before the Nares was involved in a film magazine. Nares and some other people called X, which I don't know if you'd heard about.
No.
But there was but it was a sort of a large format, like a tabloid thing, and it was people would write film stuff in it. It was pretty interesting. It only ran for a few issues, but there was a big benefit for that. There was another one of the big early no wave shows. It was at a club on St. Mark's called Millennium that mostly did dance stuff, but it was like the Contortions played there, the DNA, a bunch of those bands played there, and that's where a lot of people saw them. Really, some of those bands for the first time, because it's the first, it was their early shows for some of them, and.
So I'm curious when you're talking about this history here. So how did your sort of life intersect with this scene? Were you dipping in and out of it? Where were you living? Like, where were you in your career? I'm sort of curious, to get a quick summary of like your career arc at that early age and times, and how you were relating to these different scenes.
I mean, I started writing sort of professionally more in '77. I mean, I've been writing about music stuff for a long time before that, but really scattershot and very poorly. And
were you living outside of New York City then, or where were you living?
Well, I went to college up here, so I was doing that. I went to Hampshire, and then I was the first person ever kicked out of Hampshire. So,
well, I think there's a monument to you on campus.
Yeah.
But I'm a huge fan of places like Hampshire. I mean, they're so important to our cultural history. So right. you were in Hampshire. So you ended up in Hampshire. I mean, that makes total sense that you were in Hampshire. It makes 100% total sense. If you were going to say you were at Amherst, I'd be more baffled by you being at Amherst than Hampshire.
Right. So anyway, we would go down to.
Go on.
But we'd go down to. We'd go. It's really only like a 2.5 at night. It's only like a 2.5, 3 hour drive. So we'd go down to New York all the time to see shows.
Right.
And then in the summer, I would, I'd be in New York. I'd be working, but going to New York a lot. I got kicked out in '76. And then I hung around the East Coast still for a while. I was in New York some in different places. And, I was trying to do writing stuff, but I didn't, I knew all these people who did magazines, but my writing was really bad. And so they would never publish it. But I would just keep hammering at it. And then in '77, I think New York Rocker started publishing me. So that was my first real professional stuff. So I was doing New York Rocker stuff.
Were you like at Hampshire, like going and seeing shows and trying to submit reviews and record reviews?
No, all the time. Yeah, sure, all the time.
Did you bring any of those New York bands up to play at Hampshire?
No, we would try, but we would always get, people would hear the tape and then they'd just be like, "No fucking way."
Well, I was just curious. I'm just curious if there's not like some sort of famous epic show you maybe had at Hampshire where.
No, we tried, but it was like, I mean, the thing is, I was gone from Hampshire in '76.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, I see.
It's, it's like, we just, the stuff that we tried to do even would have been earlier, really, than that. Right. I mean, Lydia did come. I mean, when I started going out with my wife was in '78. Emily Hubley, who's the sister of Georgia Hubley from Yo La Tengo.
Okay, yeah.
She had gone to Hampshire. And she was doing her final show, her Division III show, they call them. It's like your thesis type thing.
Yeah.
In '78. And we went up because the Ray Beats were playing outdoors, and then Eight-Eyed Spy was playing that night in Northampton. So we sort of went back up with them. But that's about the closest, anything.
Sure. Yeah.
But
so
Georgia and I had a new wave band.
You left Hampshire and you went to New York?
Yeah, New York, and I just sort of bounced around the metropolitan area, and then I went out to the West Coast at the very beginning of '78, but it was like, I lived in San Francisco. When I'd live there, I'd just live at people's houses, or I'd live in punk magazine, offices, or at writers' house. I didn't really have a place to live for a couple of years, but I would just travel between New York, LA, San Francisco, and Boston, depending on who would send me the money for a bus ticket to do something. Right. And the thing is, they had started this thing then in '76 where it was $54 for a bus ticket anywhere in the United States. And you could make as many stops as you wanted as long as you just kept going in one direction.
Right.
So you'd go to Chicago, see some stuff there, and I was a official writer for New York Rocker, and I had a press pass and all that stuff. so I could get into clubs everywhere for free. So you'd go, okay, we'll go to Chicago, then I'll go down to Austin, and then so I'd just sort of do that, and you'd know some people because there were writers there that you knew, or a band that you had done something with, and people would just let you crash. And I was in my early 20s, so it wasn't really like, I just had a typewriter. That's all I had.
Right. Sure.
A little portable typewriter.
Yeah,
And I'd go and I'd type stuff up and send it in. And
what kind of typewriter did you have?
it's like an old, like this little Smith Corona, portable, little case my parents had gotten me when I was like, for my 8th birthday, I think.
Wow.
And
do you still have that?
I've wondered about that. I don't really know. I'm not sure. It might be stuck in storage somewhere. But,
Sure.
but yeah, so I just did that and then I would end up certain places for longer periods of time. And when I was in New York, I would just always live at the New York Rocker office because that was just, it was easy to live there. And bands rehearsed there, like the band Information rehearsed there, and the DB rehearsed there, and other people. But it was and it was 23rd Street and Broadway was convenient. And, I'd work down if I worked down at Tier 3 or something like that, it was wild because in those days, if I got off work, I could walk all the way back to 23rd Street from White Street, which is probably 35 or 40 blocks, in the middle of Broadway, and there'd never be a car.
Right. Amazing. Yeah.
Because downtown was really not inhabited. But so I did that for a long time, and then I drifted around, and then I ended up in Boston for a while, and I started a magazine there, and then I moved out to LA, and I did stuff there.
What was the magazine you started in Boston?
It was called Take It.
Take It? And
Yeah.
What were you, so if you were the editor of that, what were you looking to publish in that? Like what kind of material? What kind of arts?
Well, we did all kinds of arts, from visual art to music. It was mostly a music magazine.
Right.
It was a tabloid. But we'd cover all sorts of stuff.
What year was that? Like late, was that early 80s, late 70s?
That was 1980.
1980, okay.
Yeah, 1980.
Take
And
It.
I think it ran for 6 or 7 issues, something like that. And but then in 81 I moved out to LA. And I did I was still actually managing editor for Take It then, and I was still writing for New York Rocker, and I did a column for the LA Weekly, and I wrote for the Reader, and I just wrote for tons of punk fanzines, like everywhere. Anybody that wanted stuff, I would do stuff for.
And so during that whole time, you were, like you said, you were interested, you were equally, I mean, not equally, but you're interested in sort of the whole context, right? The art scene, the thinker.
Well, I was starting to get in. I was starting to find out. I had gone to school. I went to Hampshire to do video art. That's what I went to college to get my
so
degree.
you definitely were schooled in that thought and those trends. Okay.
Oh yeah, we had stuff. We had a video collect. I had a video collective with Ken Burns.
That's amazing. Yeah.
called XTV.
XTV.
And, yeah.
And where was that? Was that
And,
was that a college thing or after college? XTV.
that was at Hampshire. At Hampshire,
Really?
and so this
And
would have been like 74.
What was that?
We
What
did
what was XTV's sort of goal, or what was your what was your jam?
we were just the thing is trying to figure out. What the thing is, our sort of my hero at that point was William Wegman, because he was from Springfield, Mass.
Oh, great.
Originally.
Yeah.
And this is also the period where George Mishunis was up in that part of Massachusetts. Also, had moved the Fluxus stuff up there, so we were really interested in that kind of thing. But we were doing, if you see video art from that period, it's just like most of it's like one idea kind of a thing, and you just kind of do it. And we had there were like 6 or 7 of us, and we would just do that. And we had stuff, a couple of stuff in museum. We had stuff in museum shows with Namjoon Paik, and
You did.
there was
You
some,
were
yeah, there was some
curated. You were curated.
yeah, a
some
little
shows?
bit. And we were shown on PBS in New York used to put in filler things. Like if a movie ended at a weird time, they'd have like 20 dead minutes. So they'd put in experimental stuff. We had a couple things that were shown on there, and in retrospect, I'm just as glad that most of it didn't really survive. But
It's got to be there somewhere. It's got to be somewhere.
it was fun to do though. Yeah, it was fun. That stuff was fun to do. But nobody could figure out how to monetize video art in those days. This is before the like MTV boom came along, you know, a few years later. Like, what do you do with this stuff? And, you know, it was kind of expensive to do because like you know, half-hour tape cost about $30 then, you know, for open reel VHS.
I think at that time period, a lot of that equipment was located in colleges or, you know, so it wasn't like floating around. It wasn't, you just like pick it up and buy it, you know. So places that had the resources were buying it and creating these laboratories, and they were often students, right, who had access to it, like you.
Yeah. You know, it was that kind of stuff. And we had, you know, we'd correspond with other people. I was also really involved in correspondence art, you know, mail art stuff and that kind of thing, because that was really
that's
cheap
a very
to do.
Fluxus sort of thing too. So did you know did you meet George then and stuff, or?
No, not really. I mean, we sort of like, you know, we were kids, and we would go to these things, and like I'd be at parties like where Dick Higgins would be there, but it was like when you're 18, you just like you don't even know what to say to.
Yeah, sure. No, I went to college
like,
with like I went to college with Hannah Higgins, Dick Higgins' daughter, and then with Robin Moore, who was Peter Moore. Peter Moore, like you, I mean, he was he documented the photos of this whole era.
Yeah, I knew Barbara pretty well.
Sure, and I bought a lot of my printed matter from Barbara, but someone like you or someone like Peter, you know, they archived and helped document the scene. You through your writing. Someone like Peter, you know, Fluxus. We wouldn't know about Fluxus. We wouldn't know about a lot of this Yvonne Rainer stuff if he hadn't photographed it, you know, and documented it. So
it's true.
I think you do the same thing with your writing that Peter did with his photography.
Right.
Yeah.
But, you know, the thing is, it's really hard when you're a teen or you're in your late 20s or something like that, because you're in these places with people who are a generation older than you, and you almost feel like you're not supposed to be there. Sure. You know, it's like I've snuck into this place almost.
Right.
And it's just like I would find those people so daunting. It's like a lot of the no wave people, even who were my age.
Yeah, they were nobody.
They were really nobodies, but they projected like this really like extreme confidence.
Yeah.
And you know, if you're a kid, it can be very off-putting. You know, and you don't want to act like a fanboy kind of like that kind of thing. Go up and you want to figure out if you could think of something really cool to say.
Right.
It was like for a friend of mine was doing sound for the Ridiculous Theater Company, and so I'd hang around there all the time. But it was like those, you know, like Charles Ludlam. Like, what am I? You know, I could never really figure out. Like, if he asked you something, it's like, yeah, sure, you know, you talk. But to go up to somebody like that and to really like, oh, you know, I really like this thing he did.
Right.
It just feels you know, you want to try to play it cool, you know, because you want somebody to not think you're an idiot.
Right, but you had such a voracious mind, and I mean, you were probably reading everything from Charles Olson to Richard Hell, right? I mean,
yeah,
I assume.
No, it's true, but you know, the thing is, you know, some people have a sort of building confidence, but I think most people are, even if you're curious about a lot of things, if you've learned them in an autodidactic way,
yeah,
you have very little confidence in the provenance kind of your information.
It feels, yeah, thank you.
It feels very secondhand. Yes. You know, there's an idea of, even if you're an anti-academic, there's an idea of an academy approved thing that somehow lends an imprimatur to your knowledge. And if you don't have that, it's like being afraid of mispronouncing a word or a name. You know, you're talking to somebody and all of a sudden you show that you're a boob because you say this, you pronounce a name completely incorrectly. Yeah, and even though nobody really cares, if you're in a situation where you're self-conscious, you feel like, oh man, I really blew it.
Well, one of my favorite sayings is never make fun of someone who mispronounces a word because they learned that word reading.
Yeah, right. No, it's true.
It's
true. Well, I never thought that. So,
you know what I'm saying? I love that saying, because the fact that you mispronounce something means that you saw it in print. So your mind was already engaged. You were already pursuing that idea. And, you know, your mind was hungry, right? You were already looking for that stuff.
Yeah.
So
it's true, but it was always easier for me to write. You know, I would write people and do stuff, you know, like whether it was Dick Higgins or Ken Kesey or somebody like that. You could write them, and then if you wrote them a few times, a lot of times they'd write you back at some point. You figure something out. And
So you were reaching out to these people in college, and then after Hampshire, when you were sort of on your own more, you were reaching out and trying to make connections.
Yeah, always, and you're always trying to figure this stuff out. It's you know, there are it there there are gaps between people's age and stuff like that that you think are a real stumbling block when you're younger. That when you as you get older, you start realizing like, oh, there's really no, I mean, there's not that much difference,
Sure.
between you and somebody who's like well established, but really they're only about 10 years old. I mean, it's not
And
that big a deal.
you both like
You like the same stuff,
you both like burritos and tennis or
It's
whatever.
true. Yeah,
You're both like John McEnroe fanatics. Who knows, right? We just
well,
we're all,
there's more commonality. If people who like weird culture, who like more obscure cultural stuff,
sure.
really they've got a common language there that you don't realize, until a little bit later. At least I didn't realize until later in my life that was something. The way that people, guys think they can go into any bar and talk about sports. you know,
Right.
it's like I decided to never know anything about sports, but can you go really into a bar? If you can go into a bar and talk to somebody about Fluxus, and somebody goes like, "Oh yeah,
So I assume as in addition to having, instilled, but, sort of looking back at that time period, being an avid listener, you must have been an avid reader, right? You must have been reading.
oh yeah, yeah,
So
yeah, a lot.
so, that's something I'm sort of curious about, like, what were you from that sort of, that specific era, we're looking, say, to focus in a bit for like the New York, what was happening in New York in the late 70s, early 80s, like I'm sort of curious, like what poets have sort of stuck with you from that time, or other writers or playwrights, what reading were you liking?
Um,
Or as we say, adjacent. It could even be adjacent. It could be 10 years earlier. You know what I'm saying?
well, a lot of the stuff right then was a little bit more visual than text oriented. I mean, there was stuff, there was text stuff around that I liked, but to be perfectly honest, it was like to buy like a lot of new books was just like nobody had any money. There were a lot of weird people putting out their own like weird little things that's in a lot of ways that's what I was reading, was more that kind of stuff. And I was reading a lot of there were so many periodicals coming out then, whether they were art ones like Vile and File, and there was just there was a lot of that stuff. Plus I didn't really have I was often not in any place for very long, so I'd be reading stuff that other people had, just really. It was a period where I didn't really own anything very much at all.
Sure.
So for me, a lot of it was just
Your typewriter.
whatever I was passing through. That's
So
what I
what about
saw.
what about someone like the poet Eileen Miles? Who's I really associate with New York, and my mind plays tricks. I'm like, oh gee, was Eileen Miles ever like at the Mud Club, or was Eileen Miles ever dating somebody who was in some woman, some band or something? Just
Well,
wondering about
I
things
mean, the
like
thing is,
that.
Thurston and I we put on some readings with her
Oh, you
later,
did. Can
and
I hear about
I've talked to her about that stuff. Well, I mean, what happened was at a certain point, we started doing more. Well, we started being around and putting together archives of like more poetic material and some stuff like that.
Sure.
So we started running into like more older, like established poets.
Like
And
Waldman and Miles, or
yeah, I mean, yeah, Waldman, Miles. I mean, guys like people like Charles Plymell. Like a lot of there were a lot of people around, and nobody was paying attention to those guys very much in certain ways. So if we'd invite them up, and say give you a couple hundred bucks to come up and do a reading, we would do. I remember one reading we did. It was like I think Charles Plymell, Eileen Miles, and Gerard Malanga.
wow,
Just stuff like that.
and that was in the Berkshires. That was in
That
Northampton.
was here, yeah. That was in Florence, at my place in Florence.
That's amazing.
So we'd do stuff like that, and and have people come up and do it, and it was we got really into that. I mean, it was like the thing is that when I really started to figure out the really underground 60s poetry stuff was just through a couple guys that I knew who were book dealers who turned me on to people like D.A. Levy and stuff like that. And so things that I hadn't really known about, I started to figure out. And it was all part of it had an aesthetic appeal. It was obviously all part of some of the same things, but it was deeper than things that I'd been able to,
Right.
find out.
Well, I think,
But
I think, sorry, go on. You finish your thought. I
The New York
apologize.
thing, the New York thing always had, the poetry project was always there, so there was always that stuff going on.
Was that at
And
St.
all,
Mark's? Was that
sometimes,
St. Mark's or?
yeah, St. Mark's, because my friend Angela grew up right across the street from there, and so you'd be over there and you'd see like, oh, Patti Smith's reading or whatever. So you'd go and there would be actually all these other like New York poets reading and stuff like that. So you'd find out about things sort of like that. It was in a way where you just made connections. But
Well, I think it would be a good time to start to segue maybe into some Q&A, and I could also
Okay.
take a quick bathroom break. Do you need a bathroom break, or you?
yeah, I could use one too. So I'll
Well,
be
why
back
don't we
in a
take a
second.
couple minute, like a 1 minute bathroom break, and we'll come back.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. I'm back. Hi, everyone. So have you been studying Fluxus in school? Do you know when he's mentioning Fluxus, the art movement from New York? If people study that? I know we talked about Dada comes up a lot in our readings, and then Hugo Ball did those lyrics, that piece that we talked about at one point that became the lyrics of the Talking Head song Izimbra. Remember, if you remember us talking about that, sort of the connection between Dada and sort of New York and what was happening there. So that was sort of like a precursor in some ways to what happened with Fluxus in the US and sort of happenings here. But Byron will be back soon. We can, I know if you've had some questions.
Oh,
Welcome
all
back.
right. Yes.
Welcome back. Yeah, so I know I thought, is it okay if we open up some Q&A?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And
If anybody has anything.
yeah, I mean, it's hard to ask questions through Zoom and stuff. I know there's a few questions we have, and one question can be 2 hours of conversation. So let's open up the floor, and please feel free to ask Byron some questions.
Mitchell was telling us that you recently published a cookbook, and we were curious to know more about that.
Oh, it's kind of a quarantine project. A friend of mine, this woman Naomi Yang, who she's a musician and she does some book design stuff.
Galaxy 500.
She got
right?
yeah, Galaxy 500 and some other stuff. She became really obsessed with. I don't know if you've seen them. There are these like church and community cookbooks that are spiral bound.
Mhm.
That you'll see in a used bookstore, and they've got like one, congregation. Each person puts in a thing, a recipe. So she was. I cook for I do a lot of cooking for different shows that I'll put on here and different parties and stuff like that. She was like, "Oh, you really have to do a cookbook like this," and I was like, "Yeah, it's a great idea. It's a great idea." But finally, with the quarantine coming along, she was like, "Okay, now it's the time to do it. I found a place that publishes things in that style, and I'll do all the design and we'll do all this stuff." And so rather than have a different bunch of people submit recipes, what you do is ask all of your friends to submit recipes that they like that you've made for them. So, Kim Gordon, Thurston Moore, Albini, like whatever, different Mascus, all these people that I know. So they all sent in like their requests with little comments. And so then I wrote up all these recipes with like, it's sort of autobiographical stuff also. And it was,
That's a fascinating way. That's a great history there. Yeah.
It was insanely time consuming, to proofreading recipes, man. It takes a really long time. I had to try all of them again to make sure that the sort of thing was right. So yeah, it was like not something that I'd ever really planned to do, but it was a project that Naomi, she really got the bee in her bonnet, and she can be very persistent when, as many people can be when they have time on their hands. And,
so she also started Exact Change. Is that correct? Or
yeah, she and Damon run Exact Change Press.
it's a poetry.
Which is mostly, translations of French surrealist.
Sure, no, it's very important. It's very important press. I love it.
Yeah.
So so were these meals that you had cooked for people? Like, was Jay like Mascus remembering a meal that you had cooked for him, or is this just a meal he liked from his childhood or something?
Jay Mascus really, as ever, was extremely opaque in his selection.
Of course.
In fact, I mean, it was really his wife that made the selection, and then he made a couple comments. But to try to get a straight answer out of Jay is.
What was his recipe? I'm just curious.
The one that I ended up doing for them was a 2-bean chili. It was a vegetarian chili that I often served at shows that we did at the Yard Space over in Florence. And Jay's a vegetarian. A lot of the recipes were vegetarian or have can be made in a vegetarian way. But it was a surprise. It was an interesting exercise.
Last time I was eating at the Gleanery in Putney, Jay was sitting at the table next to me, and it took all my willpower not to say hi to him. So I just let him eat his meal in peace. And I don't know if that's a great restaurant. I don't know if you've ever been there up in Putney, the Gleanery.
Yeah.
Isn't that what it's called? The Gleanery?
No, he's something like that. Yeah.
So that's amazing history for you, like, because it brings together the personal thing of food, like friendships. So it's like it's another form of memoir, sort of. Really, it's interesting.
It is kind of a memoir because my kids put in stuff too, and then like Thurston's daughter, and just like all this, stuff like that, and and they were a lot of them had to do with like shows that they'd seen or shows that they'd done or whatever stuff that I made like for art openings or whatever else. I got to tell this one story. Emily Hubley asked for this recipe that we had made. It was Emily and Georgia's parents were famous filmmakers, John and Faith Hubley. They were famous animators. Yeah. And every year they had worked for Disney, and then they had been involved in trying to unionize the studio and been blacklisted by Disney in the 50s. Moved to the East Coast and moved to New York, and then started their own studio there and did some of the first adult animation for adults in the U.S., very influenced by the Czech filmmakers and stuff. Anyway, they did a pretty well-known Oscar part. Every year they did an Oscar party at their apartment. They originally lived on Madison Avenue, and then Emily's father died in '76. And the first year after that, then they had moved to Park Avenue, and her mom, like Emily and I started talking like we could make this Oscars out of chopped liver and stuff like that. And her mom was like, "Yeah, you guys you take care of it. You do all the." How this happened, I don't exactly know. So we catered this like Oscar party with like chopped Oscars made of chopped liver and these like things with Jello cubes and Pez and all this shit. And I mean, I can remember Gary Trudeau just looking at it and going like, ugh, like there's nothing here to eat. And it would be like, but all these like well-known people, because they were, the Hubleys are so weird because you'd be talking to Emily's mom, when she was alive, Faith, and she'd go like, oh yeah, when Marcel and Teeny would come over, we'd like play game nights and stuff like that. And I'd be like, what? Yeah, like your head would explode. Like, whoa. And you'd go out to visit her, you go driving with her and stuff like that. Anytime you walked around New York with her, all of a sudden you'd be running into all these like famous people who were like friends of hers and stuff. It's really insane.
That's incredible.
It was, but anyway, it was pretty
So
funny.
I'm gonna order that book today. I know we had some I know we had some other questions. Sophie, didn't you have a question?
Yeah, we were discussing nihilism earlier and wanted to pick your brain on how you think that interacts with post-punk and what your perspective on the philosophy is.
Well, the thing is, it's post-punk in general is such a wide open thing. I mean, I could think of it more specifically to no wave stuff. I can talk to that a little bit more specifically because, post-punk is it's such a nebulous idea. I mean, I guess in a way, post-punk sort of starts when the Sex Pistols end,
right,
and Public Image starts. I mean, I guess in a sort of general way, and especially then once Lydon goes on the Peel show and does this guest DJ spot where he plays no punk rock. He's playing like Captain Beefheart and Can and Dr. Ali Montado and all that stuff. And so that, in a lot of ways, I think of that stuff as being English. And I don't know enough about English stuff, but in New York, in terms of the no wave stuff, there was definitely an element of that in there. One thing that never seems to come across so much with when people talk about some of the people who were involved in that, James Chance a little bit less, but a lot of these people had a very, very good sense of humor. There were a lot of jokes, like that sort of a cruel kind of you think of a very New York-y kind of a humor, but there was a lot of that going on. But at the same time, really, like, people were in New York, and everything that happened in New York made it seem like the end of the world was getting closer and closer and closer. And I think for a lot of people, it really felt like that everything was kind of ending, like when Nares would make like a film like Rome 78, I mean, it was like, the collapse of the Roman Empire, and this is like the collapse of New York City. New York City was bankrupt, it was just, everything was falling apart. And there was, somebody like Lydia, all her persona, and a lot of these people, I could never figure out how legitimately they felt this way. But they were very, very like negative. They were interested in the end of, like the end of the line. Like, this culture stops with me. I mean, there's not going to be another generation. It's like this line, this whole line of stuff is getting close to its end, and that's it.
And we were all sort of curious about, I think, about nihilism, though, about looking at it a bit from, say, like the John Cage perspective, where it's more about sort of being open to the world and sort of having no expectations and sort of allowing sort of radical things to happen, like 433, things like that.
Right.
Where you're radically opening your heart, sort of, and sort of pushing down your ego and allowing sort of, it's almost like that Buddhist take on things. And it's hard to, how could you possibly mention no wave and Buddhism in the same conversation, right? But you probably, maybe you can. Maybe you can.
Yeah, sure, you can. I mean, the thing is, there are elements of that in there, but I think that those were more people's personal takes on things.
Yeah.
That was not any what they were trying to project with a lot of this stuff was kind of the exact opposite of that. There was an extreme formal, it's like a kind of formal aggression. But the formal aggression by itself was kind of a joke, and it was taking advantage of the fact that, taking advantage of a certain kind of freedom that was there because there were no expectations. I mean, there was a kind of societal no expectation. I'm not saying a general society, but inside this community, in a way, it's kind of the last time where I really feel like people who grew up in my generation, which was, when I was in grade school, we were always doing bomb raids. We were doing these nuclear things. It was get under your desk, hold your, roll up in a ball, hold your head, or go out in the hall and do it. And we didn't really know what was going on, but they really instilled this idea in us that, like, everything could be over anytime. And for some people, that really had a huge effect on them. Even if it didn't have a huge effect on you, it was always sitting there in the back of your mind. And at some point and I feel like around the end of the late 70s, the end of the 70s is when that's really started to dissipate. As people got older and they had enough experience behind them that they could see they were going to outlive this period. And so they started having a whole different way of looking at stuff. And I think that's why some of the bands that were post-punk bands and no-wave bands all of a sudden became more rock and roll bands. So they became bands that functioned more as like rock music rather than like a weird art music.
Yeah.
That was not... And they lost the darkness that had been... I mean, they stopped trading in the darkness that had been a real part of a lot of their sound, and started like opening up and manifesting kind of a more... it wasn't more... I can't say it was more commercial because I don't think any of them really thought of that, but it was a different form of music.
More traditional.
It was more of a rock... You could call it... You could identify it as rock music. Sure. Which in a lot of... And even other post-punk stuff, in its original form, it was very difficult to identify what it was because it didn't have a lot of the same kind of, functions, danceability, or whatever else, this kind of approachable surface that you think of music as having. And I don't think that really, I think I'm sort of dodging your question in a way.
No, it's okay.
But
No, it's
but I mean, it's. I think that people. It was a period of time where, at least in New York was so chaotic that you really had to have a pretty hard shell to live there.
Sure.
If you were going to live in a bad neighborhood, which a lot of people did. And they were really, there were streets you could walk on and streets you didn't want to walk on. And that was part of everybody's existence. If you wanted to pay $180 to live somewhere, right, you needed to really like carry yourself in a certain way and do a certain kind of thing. And I feel like that informed, we didn't have the sort of squat thing that people had available in London. If you talk to Chris Cutler or those guys, what they were able to do with, we can just take this building over and the city will allow us to do it for this amount of time if we do these certain things. And, in New York, that was you could occasionally find a place to squat, but it was nothing very sanctioned, and you always were in a
Precarious. It's precarious. Yeah.
Yeah, much more precarious situation.
I know there's a couple other. I know there's a couple other questions. Because I know you're heavily involved in seeing music being distributed and making it and pressing records and getting that out there. And I think Danny had a question about music today and distribution. Did you have that, Danny?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I was, I guess, wondering what you think about like music streaming. I know that I listen to music on Spotify. I'm
Sure.
just wondering how you feel like that's sort of influenced the
It's obviously, I mean, the thing is, it's great to be able to hear all this stuff. What's really been tough in the pandemic is that once what it does, something like Spotify decommodifies music. I mean, because the way that people have been making money from music over the last, 70 years is by creating a commodity of it, whether it was sheet music or whether it was a recording or something like that to sell. When the streaming stuff sort of happened, when that decommodified, so you're really not getting much money from these recordings. For a band or an artist to make any money, it goes to live performance. So the pandemic has been a terrible, terrible blow to anybody who's trying to do something like that.
Because you can't sell a physical copy. You can't tour.
Yeah, right. You can't have merch at a show because you can't do a show, and it's like, the thing is, because what happened was people decided to make things that weren't on, say, Spotify or Bandcamp or wherever like that people could buy, and that was a way for them to sort of like slip a few dollars to the artist. And without that, it's pretty tough. But I think it'll go back towards that because it separates the wheat from a chaff in a certain kind of way. I mean, what I think of, there people who do music because they have to do music and that's what they want to do and that's really what they do, and people who are doing it because they think, oh, I could work this into a job. I mean, and there's nothing wrong with making money from doing what it is that you really like, and I don't mean that, but I'm saying that at a certain point, as somebody who's written, for music magazines for over 40 years, you see like you get all this stuff from publicists and all these layers of people between the artist and the music who are trying to sell this object that gets further and further and further away from the music. And I'm not really interested in that. And these people who get into that system specifically because, some manager or somebody cons them into this thing. Oh, you can make this money, do this, do that, go into debt this way, go into debt that way. And, I don't want to say that everybody should just be playing house shows, but people who are playing house shows, I think, are more people who are doing it because for the right reasons.
They're lifers. Yeah, they're lifers.
Lifers, not careerists.
Right.
It's kind of that distinction, and I don't think that streaming is a really good way to hear stuff that you wouldn't hear otherwise. I mean, there's no getting around that. If you read about something or you hear somebody mention something to you, as eloquently as they may describe it, their experience of this music may be entirely different than your own. They may hear one thing and you listen to it and you're like, I have no idea how you were describing it that way. And that's useful because everybody hears things in different ways. So yeah, I mean, it's like, it's all right. It definitely cuts back on being able to sell records, but that's just the way it is. I mean, we put out 81 records last year.
You did.
And there's just 2 of us. Yeah. Our
Yeah.
label.
And what's the name of your label?
Feeding Tube.
Feeding Tube.
And
you search these artists out. Is that how that works? And
yeah. Although now we have so many artists that we work with, it's mostly, I mean, we get deluged with demos and stuff like that.
Sure.
But a lot of times we have a bunch of artists that we'll work with. We continuously put stuff out with, although we don't tell any of them don't put stuff out with other labels. It's like, we can't do this. I mean, I can't do another one right now. Fine,
right.
Whatever. I mean, being an artist it's a tough racket to try to, support yourself or even partly doing that stuff. So we don't really put much on that, but we do smaller pressings. So you just need to, you need to figure out what the market will bear, and then sort of stick to that. And we have low expectations on. You just need to be realistic on doing it, I think.
But I think it's
but,
fascinating, having a label like Feeding Tube. I mean, what you're doing is, you're becoming a curator, sort of archivist of this time, by creating these albums and putting them out. It's your sort of your taste, your sort of stamp of approval. So, just like,
Right.
No New York, sort of archive that one little moment in time. You're sort of doing that as well. And, if it's like with it, Take It, you did you're publishing Take It, or now doing this label. I mean, you've been doing this your whole life, right? I mean, this is what you do.
I've been doing it for a long time. I mean, it's interesting to me. It's like, it's so much stuff. I mean, I talked to friends of mine about bands that we saw when we were in high school, local bands, and there's just no documentation. It's as if they never existed,
Right.
And that always really bothered me. The fact there's nothing, there's no documentation anywhere of that. And so a lot of time for me, it's like it's putting a place mark that, like, you can say this object shows that this happened. And we do archival stuff as well. I mean, we put out like 5 albums by Mars.
Really?
And, and stuff like that. Yeah.
You didn't release the show they did at Artist Space, did you?
Yes, we did.
Oh, you did. Oh, I
Yeah.
got to get that. I didn't realize you did that. Okay. I've got to grab that. Thank you for putting that out. Were there how are those recordings from that festival? Is there other stuff you had put out from that or not?
Well, there supposedly are, but the masters are sort of, the guy who ran the sound then was this guy Perry Branston,
Uh-huh.
who was later involved in this club Stinkies that became the Black Hole that sort of mutated into Tier 3.
Yeah.
And he recorded some of it. Some of it's the sound wasn't very good. Some of it people didn't want to do. Like, we've been trying to find a good recording of the Gynecologist or something like that. They're tough. And then dealing with the people who are in the bands, there are often people who are not very happy with there are people who think like, oh, that's just not representative. And it's like, well, it's a very small thing and it would just be a document, but they're like, no, I don't want anything to do with it. And it's fine. You do that, you go back to them in 5 years and ask again, and that's about all you can do.
Well,
But,
I'm glad
if somebody doesn't want,
I mean, we're grateful you're doing that work. I mean, that work has to be done, right? And you've been doing that, so thank you.
yeah.
Well, the class is actually officially over, but students might have to leave. They're probably tumbling out as we speak. But I have one sort of quick question. I mean, I'm just sort of curious, like, what was happening sort of like on the West Coast and the East Coast back then, because we have like, say like you have like Chris Burden on the West Coast, and then you may have like someone like Gordon Mata Clark on the East Coast. And I just was wondering, like, as you were sort of hopping back and forth between the coasts during that time, what were some of the things that you were noticing as differences and sort of similarities?
Well, I mean, Burden's gallery shows were always on the East Coast.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So he's a Cal Arts person showing in New York.
He was, he was always shown at Castelli. I mean, that's where we'd always go to those. I mean, I just went to all his openings.
So you saw those at Castelli, okay.
Yeah. And, but he taught at, I mean, it's interesting because he taught at UCLA. And, like the guys from the Urinals who did Happy Squid Records were students. Bruce Leischer from Savage Republic and Independent Project was a student there. He was a big influence on a lot of people. I mean, there's no denying that. Although he supposedly wasn't really that great of a teacher, is what friends of mine have said. But he instilled certain ideas in people really well.
Sure.
But the coasts were different. I mean, like, I spent, San Francisco. I mean, when I lived in San Francisco in the late 70s, it was the cheapest city I'd ever lived in my life.
Wow.
And San Francisco was cheap. There were so many neighborhoods that were really inexpensive there, that it, I mean, there were a lot of people who'd been around there for a long time and were doing a lot of stuff. And there was a lot of intergenerational stuff. A lot of the punk bands in San Francisco were kids out of the San Francisco Art Institute. Whether it was the Avengers or, like whoever, all of them were, and a lot of them were almost more like art projects in a way, in the way that, the Ramones in New York almost seemed like an art project first,
Right.
if you were looking at them in a certain kind of way. But there were always fewer small galleries on the West Coast than there were like in New York.
Mm-hmm.
There would be some, but like LA is so spread out. It's a weird, it's a car town, and it's weird, but there would be like, weird scenes inside there, like all the people involved in the Los Angeles Free Music Society, which was largely based in Pasadena, but it was, they would have gallery things interactive with like, film and different stuff like that, I never really was in Detroit like for the early Destroy All Monsters stuff, which was Mike Kelly and Mike Kelly's thing there, which was pretty interesting from everything that I know about it. But there were just pockets of weirdness everywhere, and a lot of it were, it's like I said, the correspondence art was a big thing then also. That's like how I met the guys from Devo, like Mother's Ball was really involved in that. Gary Panner, people like Irene Dogmatic in San Francisco, and, Anna Banana up in Canada. And, there was a big network of that kind of stuff, and you'd get a thing like a Ray Johnson, like postcard. You'd be like, ah,
Well, and mail was how we communicated, right? That was how you communicated.
Yeah.
I mean, that was
Sure,
it.
yeah.
You were either doing it in mail or in person, right? Or the
Right,
telephone.
phone calls were well, that was expensive though. People forget.
Yeah.
Or some people never knew, but phone calls used to be really expensive.
Sure.
Long distance calls across the country would be whatever.
So there's probably a lot more sort of correspondence from that time period than there would be today, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, I have all my correspondence from 1980 on, and I've got boxes. I used to do like an hour or 2 hours of letter writing every morning.
Sure.
And that was just
that's
was
incredible
pretty standard.
to hear. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
So,
well, I want to thank you. A lot of the students, they have other classes and have to move on, but I wanted to thank you, and just having people say thank you. Thank you to Byron, and thank you.
I'm sorry it wasn't a little more. It wasn't a little more of a piece, but whatever.
No, it was great. I loved sort of learning more about the person. Getting some of your story out there too. Because and then the things about what's happening in the art world then and now. So it was greatly appreciated. So thank you very much for your time. And I just wanted to, they want to say wave goodbye to Byron. I'll get a picture
so long.
of that. I'll get a picture of that. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much. So I'll be in touch, but I want to thank you very much again for taking the time to come in and share, your time and your knowledge with us.
Yeah.
Byron. It was really, really helpful. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you so much. Have a good day. Have a good weekend.
Great. Okay, you too. Thanks.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.